Hello everyone, I'm back today with another video. This is going to be an after-the-fact recording with commentary added of my first round game from the North American Championships that were held in 2024. And I believe they did extend into 2025, depending on how far that one made it in the tournament. But this was a tournament hosted for North American players, as the name implies. At the end of 2024, I think this game would have been played around the end of November. And the structure of the tournament is that there are 4 groups, and they each have 6 players, and they are round robin. So you play everyone in your group. So that means that the group stage is 5 games long, and if you are top 2 in your group after the group stage, then you move on to I believe it was single elimination bracket, which means only 8 players out of 24 who signed up would actually be moving on to the elimination stage, which was pretty stringent qualification, come to think of it. But for my round 1 game, as you can see here, I was paired with Silverhammer, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. He's definitely a bit of a staple in the Stratego YouTube side of things. I've played him a lot before. I usually do tend to get the upper hand, but we'll go ahead and get right into this game. So I had planned for this game, you can see my setup is actually a bit unorthodox in a way, but I had planned for this game to be aggressive on the left side. And actually, I was kind of intending to be aggressive on the left side to the point of even losing the kernel. Hopefully for info, hopefully for actually getting something. And then after that, sort of playing normally, but also having another kernel on that side. Kind of a bit of a surprise. Hopefully one that would be useful for me. It's not quite as useful if I discover general and my kernel's effectiveness is blunted, but it's a lot easier if I can trade kernels and then I simply have another kernel. I would have been fine to give it away for info too. But I planned pretty early on to be aggressive on that left side. Had buried pieces otherwise. He usually doesn't take too many crazy risks, especially in tournament games, or like serious games where he's sitting down and making a real concerted effort to play well. So he hits me there with his Sergeant, which kind of surprises me. Not as strong as I would have liked, so I kind of just immediately go a little crazy there and just lauder that scout. And then I scout this Major there, which I found it interesting that he moved it over. Wasn't really thinking much of it. So then I decided, well, okay, I guess I'll probably move over and apply some pressure, and then immediately I'm taken by his Marshal. And I guess in hindsight, that Major move did make sense, because after I had taken the scout, he didn't want me to come down with the scout and be able to check the Marshal, so he needed to put a piece there to be able to take my scout if I were to do that. So I think that's what moving over with the Major was about. But anyway, I discovered his Marshal pretty early on in the game there. A little bit unexpected. Didn't necessarily get as much for my Marshals as I would have liked. Although I got a Sergeant, so it's better than nothing. And I guess that's technically up 2 because he hit it into that bomb there. But at this point, I'm not really sure how to react because my general is pretty buried. So I guess that was the danger of losing my kernel, which I did kind of intend to lose early, but that was the danger of losing my kernel to a Marshal without really getting much in exchange for it. The danger that my setup presents is that my general is not easily accessible. So maybe something to have thought through a little bit more closely before I actually began the game. But I wasn't too worried at this point. It was very early stages of the game. And he wasn't very mobile across his setup yet. Like, he had a lot of these pieces in the center that I might have been able to take advantage of, in theory, even if I didn't have my general accessible. But I was struggling a little bit to figure out what exactly to do at this stage of the game. So I'm trying to figure out how I can find out information in the center and hopefully gain some pieces, but I don't really have access to my general. So he takes that Lieutenant, which was not very convenient for me. I do take back with my Major, and I do believe I get lucky in that he actually doesn't have a piece there that can take my Major back. So I decided to hit it. It's a trade. That makes a lot of sense, especially because he didn't actively hit my Major, but he also didn't run away with the piece. So it makes trading the most likely outcome there, and in fact we do. And then he scouts, runs that scout down. We trade scouts, and at this point my general is a little bit accessible, and I realize that, but I don't want to just rush in if there's nothing for me to hit. So I'm trying to gain a little bit more information and see where that leads me. But it was helpful that we had that exchange because it made my general go from being pretty buried to really accessible in a short amount of time. So then he hits me with his lieutenant, which is good, because now I'm not down that lieutenant anymore. I'm simply up a captain and up a sergeant for being down that colonel. So at this point, I probably would have come up with my general, except for the fact that I was getting pressured on the left side. I didn't want my trap, or on the right side. I didn't want my captain to get trapped or anything like that. So I figured I'd kind of let him run his course if he wanted to pressure my captain or come into my setup and see what would happen there. I did want to pull this captain up just to make sure the bomb didn't get discovered too cheaply. I decided to hit that, not exactly sure for what reason. I guess he didn't know my captain, so I was figuring I might be strong enough to take it if he was trying to, scout around, figure out what was going on rather than come down with like a colonel or a major or something like that. I was trying to figure out how to defend the captain, especially because I had that bomb there. I guess I think I figured I'd pull the colonel over and just double guard it with that and the bomb. So I go ahead and pull the captain over. I know there's no defense there to be had. I find it interesting that he just hit it with his major straight away rather than bringing his marshal down one more spot and, giving himself the opportunity to attack that colonel back or whatever I took his major with if I decided. So at this point, I think I was getting impatient. I figured, okay, I'm just gonna, kind of just hit that with my captain. He'd been kind of, sending down some of those bluff scouts to try to figure things out. So I move up with this scout that I've kind of already moved, and I want to get some info. I don't want to like just run up and immediately trade generals. That wouldn't quite be the best outcome of finally getting to move my general. But I discover that colonel, and I realize, okay, his general's probably in the center. I've got an exposed colonel there. I also can kind of leverage that where if he moves his colonel away, then I can take this this captain in the center with my major. So I figure at this point, okay, I can go ahead and move up with my general, and we can go ahead and attack and see if we can make any progress there. His marshal's just kind of wandering on the left side, which I guess did make me wonder a little bit during the game. But he certainly wasn't worried about defending like his center, so I figured his general would probably be there. But hopefully by coming up on the right side, I might be able to take advantage of his general being a little bit more out of position. He must have suspected there was a chance this could be the spy, because he didn't move his marshal down next to it, and then he actually used a scout on it. Of course, it was just a sergeant there, so nothing much. So here I'm thinking I'm going to get a colonel, and I think that piece is just coming up to check me. But in fact, that's his general, which actually really surprised me, because he has all these move pieces in the middle, including this captain and this colonel, which I know makes, no effort to really defend any of them as marshals. Just down here, sort of helping out with an attack, but not really. So I was kind of surprised by that general trade. But I do know that colonel, which is helpful because I am down the colonel, so it's good that I know that. So at this point, I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'll attack in the center. I mean, apparently he doesn't have as much strength there, because you wouldn't just cluster probably all your colonels and majors in the center if your general wasn't there to guard them. So I was figuring the center might not be as strong as I had figured. I decide I guess I'll just come up with a scout. I feel like I guess I could have, dragged my colonel toward the center, but I feel like his marshal just would have retreated at that point, so there wouldn't have been much of a point to doing that. I don't have like an incredible lead at this point, even in the smaller pieces. I am up 2 scouts, but I'm only up a sergeant and a major in exchange for being down that colonel, which is not too big of a lead. But I think my objective at this point was to bring up that scout, maybe like find a spy, maybe, was kind of the goal. But I wasn't really sure where his second colonel was. I guess I might have been able to come in the center with my colonel, but I figured his marshal would just defend. So he threatens me on that right side with that back row piece. Figured it's nothing strong, but unfortunately he can beat that scout that I had just brought up. He's probably using it to, check what might be coming in against his colonel. And that is also an interesting thing. Like, he just blindly traded generals, which is understandable. Like, the general would be the most useful piece that I could bring up in that situation. But he didn't even think about if it might be a scout or if it might be the marshal. Maybe I figured his general would be on this side with the spy. Maybe I wanted to come and pressure that with my marshal. And he just hit it. As again, it's understandable, but just kind of an interesting note there. So I'm trying to make some sort of attack in the center. He pulled out away the piece that was guarding this. So I come up with the captain, and then he just defends it with that. So it's a bit, not sure where that leaves me. But he does give me being up a lieutenant in exchange for being up that sergeant. And then he gives me another lieutenant by hitting the bomb. He must have figured. I think he figured there was a chance it was the spy. I think he thought there was the spy on this side of the board for most of the game, between his hesitancy with his marshal to move down, checking that bomb. General hesitancy with the marshal in general. He was not very aggressive with it at all. And I wonder why he thought there might be a spy there. I guess maybe my very aggressive colonel might have clued him in on that versus my buried general might need a spy less, but I did end up having it more on this side of the board here. But with him hitting his lieutenant on that bomb, I did kind of have a pretty solid small piece lead at this point in the game. And I did have the info advantage by knowing his marshal, even if I would have liked to have known his second colonel. I was pretty confident at this point. I was fine to give up that scout to trade captains. It's a bit of a risky play by him, but nothing crazy. But I was feeling pretty good about being up those two lieutenants. That's a pretty hefty lead, especially with the number of captains and his number of majors kind of dwindling. But I do bring my major over here. I knew that this was the colonel. I knew the general had spawned here. And this piece was from around the same area, so I figured a major would be enough to handle that piece. So I do take that once he moves that away, because I know this is a captain. So I knew that was pretty much a free piece for the taking, as long as he wasn't just sitting his colonel there, which wouldn't have made any sense given where his general was and how I was aggressive in the center. But he does that trade for me. But that does bring me another piece, so another minor, so it's pretty useful. So I couldn't take that minor, another piece. I'm a little bit scared of the possibility of a second colonel, so I do run away with that major rather than attacking it. And at this point, I think the real climax of the game starts to approach. I do want to figure out this piece. I can't really think of much else where the colonel would be unless it hadn't moved at all. This, at this point, was kind of making me think spy. But he comes down pretty aggressively with the colonel on this side. He manages to get my major into a pretty submissive defensive position there, kind of in the back row, or toward the back rank there. So then he retreats with that piece. And at this point, I want to scout it to confirm, but I'm wondering if it's the colonel, and in fact it is. And then I realize what he's doing is he's going to bring this colonel around to trap my major. And I realized that immediately, just as soon as he was backing it up before I even knew it was the colonel. I was figuring that might be what he would do if it was the colonel. And in fact it was. I figured the other possibility for it might be that it could be the spy, trying to lure like my marshal to move next to it. There could even be a role for the spy to play in what he's doing now. So I have to come over with real marshal. I don't really have any choice, and I figure I might get a colonel out of it. And in fact, I'll go ahead and pause it there. I do. He just leaves the colonel there. I think he was thinking that my spy was the colonel. But even if you thought, or that my spy was the marshal, but even if you thought that my spy was the marshal, this doesn't actually make the most amount of sense. because I can move my marshal then, if this is my marshal, over and threaten both of your colonels at the same time, and they're both known colonels. And yeah, I guess that does give them the possibility to, you know, come in the center with one or keep trapping the major with the other. But none of those options are really that good, because if you come in the center with one, you're going to get probably some garbage pieces, because you know my major's here. You're going to get probably some garbage pieces, and then you're going to end up being down your colonel advantage and still down the major. Or if you trap the major, like that's great. In a sense, you're not down a major anymore, but then I get your other colonel's trapped, and you're still down all these small pieces. So even if you thought that was my marshal, I think there probably just wasn't much of an opportunity to be trapping this major here. But once I took his colonel, I had a pretty insurmountable lead at this point, being up the major and the 2 lieutenants and the 2 minors, but not down anything. And then he comes up with a major and just trades, which I found kind of random. Maybe he didn't actually know that major, and he was hoping he might be able to get something, but if I'm being so aggressive with that piece as I was earlier in the center and as I was just then, it doesn't make sense for it to be too much of anything else, I don't think. But at that point, he just basically surrenders. I think if I'm him, it's probably worth it to come down with his marshal and just at least try to lotto. You really never know. I mean, you should always try for an open flag, even if the chances of that aren't very high. But that was the end of the first round of this tournament. Brought me to 1 win, 0 losses, so it's a pretty good start. I think Max played pretty well. He's played a pretty patient game, and I'll say he definitely played well insofar as he was patient. So as soon as he lost a bit of patience, I think the game started to get away from him. But I think, just got to be careful of those smaller pieces, because even before I got his colonel, I had a bit of a lead in these that made me pretty confident. But he played pretty well, and he had pieces in good positions, like his general just being able to come up like that was pretty good. So I think it was a pretty good game overall. But I was happy to come away with the win and a good start for this tournament. So after the first game, I'll go ahead and leave it there, and I'll see you all in my next video.